Russia tomorrow. The European Union is adopting a new package of sanctions against Russia. The export of drones and aircraft engines has been prohibited, not just to Russia, but also to third countries that are able to act as a middleman, such as Iran. Russian TV channels are off the air. New bans on investments in the energy sector have been introduced. At the same time, exporters of fertilizers were removed from sanction lists. Kiev reacted strongly. And Reuters writes that the package was only approved with great difficulty and ended up being softer than expected. For example, Gazprombank, through which oil and gas payments had transferred, was not subject to sanctions, and in general, the discussion around sanctions repeats the talking points of the recent dispute over the oil price ceiling. As Reuters writes, Poland and the Baltic countries proposed much tougher sanctions that would apply to both gas and the nuclear industry. Germany said no. The outcome is this.
Now we are careful with sanctions so that we don't go so far that we would totally damage the European economy, said Edita Hrda, the ambassador to the European Union of the Czech Republic, which holds the EU presidency. If we push certain steps against Russia, it could cost some political leaders their job. We need to give the countries time to adjust. We need a prosperous Europe in order to help Ukraine, said Hrda, who chaired meetings of EU countries, including those that set the shape of the most recent sanctions.
The logic is clear. Prices will soar, and the populists, meaning Putin, will sweep the elections. As a result, sanctions against individuals became the bulk of the ninth package, making up around 200 people, including Deputy Prime Ministers Galikova and Abramchenko, ministers, businessmen and Putin's close associate Yuri Kovalchuk, along with his family, the chairman of the Constitutional Court Valery Zorkin, governors, Kadyrov's daughters, as well as Grigory Leps and the film director Nikita Mikhalkov. Once upon a time, Mikhalkov was Russia's main star in the West, shooting films with Mastroianni and conquering Cannes. Now he is close to Putin and one of the key Kremlin propagandists. And now he finds himself under sanctions. The head of the Russian division of Transparency International, Ilya Shumanov, explains the logic with which the sanctions list was compiled.
7 губернаторов, если не ошибаюсь, члены правительства.
Governors, members of parliament, Ministry of Education officials, many of them are included in the sanction lists under the claim of illegal transportation, meaning the movement of children from Ukraine to the Russian Federation. It is a new position as far as the justification of the sanctions, and a very interesting development, in my opinion. At the same time, a very large number of the employees of the general staff, people related to the military-industrial complex, soldiers, too, are mentioned in this ninth package of sanctions included in the sanction lists, on the basis that Russian troops are destroying civilian infrastructure and causing the death of civilians. That is the argument. There is also an already well-established bloc targeting propagandists who, through their activities, publicly support the war and spread misinformation. And sanctions are thus introduced against Russian TV presenters and popular video bloggers like Dmitry Goblin-Puchkov.
At the same time, the US State Department published its latest sanctions list. It is smaller, containing around 40 names, but it includes Vladimir Potanin, the last remaining large oligarch in today's Russia, who had not yet been sanctioned. It is clear why. Potanin is the chairman of Norilsk Nickel, and the West feared a rise in metal prices. For the same reason, Norilsk Nickel itself did not fall under the sanctions. Along with Potanin, his wife and children are on the list, as well as his $300 million Nirvana yacht, which will be seized if American officials can get their hands on it. Potanin is an active participant in the murky waters of the Russian economy. For example, he bought out a large stake in Tinkoff Bank after Oleg Tinkoff was essentially forced to sell below market value. But the purpose of these individual sanctions is still unclear. Are they to stop the war, or are they a punishment? Ilya Shumanov sees contradictions in the logic of the sanctions.
If you carefully read the reasoning and aims of the imposition of sanctions, the main rationale is attempting to change the behavior of the Russian elites and people associated with national decision-making, in particular, to try to cause an end to the war in Ukraine. Of course, some of the people on the sanction lists, they can't come remotely close to the center of the decision-making process, to Vladimir Putin or the people who help him make decisions. Thus, it seems very difficult to see their role in putting an end to the war. So the focus of the sanctions turns toward punishment for the deeds they have done, which is a slightly different purpose from the attempted behavior change expected by the regulators and authorities of the countries making these decisions. This is simply a way to justify the punishment of people who, in the opinion of those national or multinational authorities, are guilty. It therefore seems strange to make accusations and decisions of guilt through the political as opposed to legal decision-making process.
Некоторые олигархи пытаются заработать себе смягчение или выход из санкционных списков.
Some oligarchs are trying to get a reprieve or get-out-of-jail card from the sanction lists. Roman Abramovich, who remains associated with Putin to this day, tried to negotiate and organize the exchange of prisoners from the Azov battalion. Mikhail Fishman and Pyotr Ivan are prepared to continue financing Alfa Bank in Ukraine. On February 24th, the day that war was declared, Putin hosted big business leaders in the Kremlin. According to the New York Times' extensive investigation, the meeting was supposed to take place earlier, but it was moved to the 24th. They gathered as many people as they could. The tanks were already bearing down on Kiev, and the oligarchs were absolutely shocked. 2 days earlier, Putin held a historic meeting of the Security Council, where he forced everyone to speak to spread the responsibility for starting the war to all high-ranking officials. And here is what the New York Times writes about that business meeting.
Another magnate recalled realizing, too late, that Mr. Putin was parading them in front of the television cameras for all the world to see for a carefully planned purpose. The point was specifically to tar everyone there, he said, to get everyone sanctioned. There was no going back. They, like the rest of Russia, were in this with Mr. Putin now.
This
This is all quite obvious. Sanctions, especially those from which there's no way out, help Putin achieve his goals of rallying the elite around him. Top officials cannot afford to leave, as it is too risky. And besides, where can they go now that they're all sanctioned? The oligarchs also have nowhere to run. At the very beginning of the war, economist Vladisław Nazimtsev suggested that the West act in the same way as after the bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999. Declare Putin a war criminal and demand his extradition in exchange for an instant lifting of the sanctions. Using this logic, the Russian establishment would at least have a motive to act. It is difficult to judge how possible this would be in reality. Shumanov offers a somewhat milder suggestion.
It might be a good solution to make the Russian elites a clearer proposal of what they are expected to do. As a suggestion, I propose the idea of open public support for institutions of civil society, including those currently in exile, forced to leave Russia and suspend their operations, as well as a clear position on Ukraine, because, in my opinion, a significant proportion of the Russian elite, which may secretly not support the war, make ambiguous comments on it in public. They are afraid to make any public statements. I know that such actions might lead to the destruction of their business, the loss of access to the Russian state budgets, and an inability to continue business in the Russian Federation, but that is the price.
We operated in Russia for 12 years, and the government tried to get rid of us 3 times. They got us on the 6th day of the war in Ukraine.
Мы временно приостанавливаем работу телеканала.
We left Russia, but we kept going. We have now decided to tell the truth about Russia, the war, and Russian society in English as well.
Kherson is Putin's 3rd major defeat in a row.
What is wrong with the Russian army?
Stories no one else can tell you. Hear it right from the source. Subscribe to our channel.